Charles, I know you can outline those statutes now for us.
So one of the interesting things about this, Ariel, is as David was just talking about, the first notion of 18 U.S. Code Section 241, which is the conspiracy against rights, is a requirement that two or more people sort of conspire to inhibit by way of injury, threatening, or intimidation someone in the free exercise or enjoyment of their constitutional or statutory right. So that's one of the charges. Again, I want people to think about the video that was played during the lead-in, where you could actually hear Don Lemon saying, I don't want to intimidate anyone. I'm going around everyone. I want to be respectful. So I just want to point people out with that. And with respect to the FACE Act of 1994, that's an act that was originally designed to keep people from harassing people who were seeking reproductive care outside of women's reproductive facilities from being harassed. And then later on, it was added, or as part of the negotiations of getting it passed, it was added on that you could not inhibit people from being in places of worship. Again, you're talking about physical obstruction. And I want, again, to draw viewers' attention to the video where we saw Don Lemon saying, I'm going around, I'm making sure that I'm not in anyone's way. Where I'm going with this, where you add in the fact that you had two different attempts to try and get a magistrate judge sign off an arrest warrant, and then you ultimately had to put this in front of a grand jury, which is a secret proceeding controlled by prosecutors. We all know that. Is that ultimately here, I can't help but to conclude that the punishment is actually the process. I think that the DOJ knows that this is a trash case. This is not a case that they are expecting ultimately to get a conviction on, but the embarrassment or the attempt to embarrass, the attempt to defame, and the attempt to intimidate the press is really what's driving this prosecution.
There may be people out there who say Don Lemon's actions were imprudent, that he was agitating, and may have known about the fact that these protesters were going to waltz into a religious establishment. But even so, that doesn't meet the mark, right?
No, it does not, because you still have freedom of the press, and he is there as a member of the press covering what is going on. So long as he is not participating in that intimidation or that physical obstruction or any of the other sort of elements of those statutes, he, as a member of the press, has a right to be there and cover what is going on. Now, the protesters, the agitators, that is a different conversation. But it is important to separate what he did in that moment because it is protected under the Constitution.
As a former federal prosecutor, would you have taken up this case?
I wouldn't. I would have listened to the 5 federal judges who've said that there's no probable cause for this case. So first, the Justice Department went to a federal magistrate judge in Minneapolis. That judge found no probable cause. The Department of Justice appealed an extraordinary proceeding. They tried to force the magistrate judge to find probable cause out of nothing. The Court of Appeals, those 3 judges, they said there's no probable cause. The senior district judge in Minneapolis, in an extraordinary move, actually wrote a letter to the Court of Appeals saying that there was no evidence that Don Lemon had committed any crime and that this was a frivolous move by the Department of Justice.
So to that end, Carol, I know you have reporting that there were prosecutors who did not want to bring these charges in the first place.
That's right. There were, as you know, from the coverage we've been doing at MS Now, there were prosecutors who resisted this idea when it was first brought last week. And as Paul was mentioning, a magistrate judge rejected it for lack of probable cause, and we reported that at the time. It's very unusual for a magistrate judge to shoot something down like this because the probable cause standard is so low. And now, again, this morning, we heard and confirmed with 2 sources that prosecutors in Minnesota and in Los Angeles, career ones, were saying this charge, 241 and 248, don't match up with the facts with regard to Lemon and some of the other people who entered the church. The most important thing to remember is that threat of force or use of force is a key part of one of these statutes. And as Paul mentioned and others on the panel, you really don't see in this video evidence of force or threat.
David Drucker, well, first of all, Carol Leonnig, thank you so much for your reporting. David Drucker, Lemon's attorney is insisting that Lemon was engaging in constitutionally protected activities as a journalist. What does the video show you?
Well, the video doesn't show us anything out of the ordinary. Look, I'm a campaign reporter, and I often find myself reporting on campaign events or talking to voters where I have to sort of contemplate how intrusive I'm being. This is not quite an apples to apples comparison. But the point is, as journalists in the field, we're constantly, trying to take into account how respectful do I need to be versus trying to get information. If I'm covering a protest, which I've done before, how are the police or how are law enforcement functioning? How am I positioning myself? And what we saw in the video doesn't appear to be anything out of the ordinary for what a lot of us have done in the field over the years. Now, look, I'll stress here, I'd like to see, the full charges and have all of the details before I make any determination as to whether they're warranted. But I think, politically, part of the problem for the Trump administration or for the Department of Justice under the Trump administration is that they don't have a lot of credibility the way a Department of Justice normally does, right? Charges like this, whatever we think of them on their face, brought 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And I think a lot of people would be saying to themselves, well, it's a journalist, so I'm a little uncomfortable. But, the DOJ is professional. They don't do things unless they've crossed all, dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's. And what we've seen from this Justice Department and its top officials is compliance with whatever President Trump wants them to do in terms of going after his political adversaries, people he has deemed political enemies, bringing lawsuits that career officials would never bring, bringing indictments, I should say, that career officials would never bring. And so right off the bat, you're thinking to yourself, this looks like a case of the president potentially personally directing the Department of Justice to take action, or top officials, Attorney General Pam Bondi, taking action that she believes will please the president. And that's in many ways the whole basis of this conversation.
So I want to play really quickly Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche talking about Don Lemon today, and then April, I'll get your reaction on the other side.
Do I have a reaction to it? I don't know what that means. What are you looking for me to do? Jump up and down? No, I don't have a reaction to it. I don't know that the charges are unsealed yet. So no, I can't. I'm not going to comment on that.
April, as a journalist yourself, first respond to what you just heard and how a case like this, what it means for journalists. How does it impact our work?
This sets a precedent. And we have to remember that this is not the first time that Donald Trump or his administration has tried to go after journalists. They went after Jim Acosta before, took his press badge, and he won through the courts his press badge back. Donald Trump didn't like Don Lemon in the first term. And the second term is no different. Don Lemon is doing what journalists do. He was not an activist. The person in that video right now that you're showing that he is interviewing was the activist. And he was chronicling what was happening as they walked into the church looking for a pastor who was a part of ICE, who was a head in ICE in that region. So at the end of the day, Don was doing a story, following a story. He was not the activist that let in. Now, what they're trying to do is place activists on a reporter. And that is a pejorative in their mind, and that's also dangerous. They're saying that not Blanche, but according to the reports from the MS Now reporter from DHS, it's these obstruction of rights. Did the activists obstruct rights and Don just followed in? This sets a precedent for how we cover our news. Don, Georgia Fort, as well as I saw a report yesterday that the Associated Press, they were not allowed necessarily to do they weren't allowed to do a report because ICE told them in Minnesota, move away, you'll be arrested. They do not want these activities covered. They do not want the nation to see. And they're trying to scare us. They're trying to use Don and Georgia Fort as an example. But I'm going to say this revolution that they have right now in Minnesota and wherever else, it will be televised because many of us are in Minnesota. Many of us are in other places using our First Amendment right. And someone who's supporting this First Amendment happens to be the mayor of Los Angeles, where Don Lemon was arrested. She spoke to me this morning. Karen Bass said that she is going to go see him after he gets out of court to make sure he's safe and he's able to be released. She says this is an affront to First Amendment rights as well. Freedom of the press. Freedom of the press. And you have to remember this, Ariel, when the checks and balances don't check and balance out, the press is supposed to have that other layer of accountability. And this is an attempt to intimidate the press from not reporting the truth, the revolution that's happening in Minnesota.